There is something almost unbearably ordinary about the final hour of a human life. There is no dramatic soundtrack. There is no slow-motion sequence. There is no narrator calmly describing the events as they unfold. For the great majority of people, the last 60 minutes look nothing like the scenes that movies and television have trained audiences to expect. The room is rarely bright and filled with tearful relatives who deliver perfectly timed final statements. It is usually quieter than that. It moves more slowly. It is more biological. In certain respects, it is also stranger and more fascinating than any dramatized version can capture. This account concerns what is actually taking place in the body, the brain, the senses, and the chemistry during those last 60 minutes of life. It is not presented in a morbid spirit. It is presented in the spirit of reporting what the science currently shows, and that science is honestly far more interesting than most people anticipate. Some of what occurs in those closing minutes is genuinely extraordinary. Brainwaves fire in patterns that researchers link to vivid consciousness. Neurochemicals flood the system in ways that investigators believe may underlie some of the most profound experiences a person can have. There is even, according to available evidence, a real possibility that the final hour contains something that from the outside resembles the most intense dream of a lifetime. The following walkthrough proceeds minute by minute and system by system, beginning with the first visible signs that the end is near and continuing all the way to the last electrical signal the brain ever produces. To understand the final hour, it is necessary first to understand what the body has already been doing in the days and hours that lead up to it, because the ending does not begin at the moment most people imagine. In most natural deaths, the dying process is gradual. The heart starts to pump a little less efficiently. Blood circulates more slowly through the body. The brain and the organs begin to receive less oxygen than they require for ordinary function. In response, the body quietly and systematically shuts down non-essential systems so that the limited remaining energy can be redirected toward the processes it treats as most critical for survival. This is not a conscious decision made anywhere inside the organism. It is simply the body following the physics of its own deterioration, doing what any system does when power runs low by prioritizing core processes and allowing everything else to go dark. By the time a person reaches the final hour, this process has already been underway for some time. The individual is usually deeply unconscious or drifting in and out of a state that is difficult to classify as either sleep or wakefulness. Blood pressure is falling. The extremities, the hands and the feet, feel cool to the touch and may display a bluish or mottled appearance, sometimes called livedo reticularis, as circulation withdraws from the outer edges of the body and concentrates around the vital organs. The legs and feet can develop a purplish, blotchy discoloration that healthcare workers recognize at once as a sign that the body has entered its final hours. The face changes as well. The muscles relax in ways they rarely do during ordinary sleep. The jaw may hang slack. The skin can acquire a waxy, pale, or slightly yellow quality. The eyes, even when partially open, tend to remain unfocused, with the irises drifted upward or to one side. Anyone who has sat at the bedside of someone in those final hours knows this appearance. It is unmistakable. It is not sleep, even though it resembles sleep. It is something further along. This is the point at which events begin to grow genuinely strange. Breathing changes dramatically during the final hour, and the manner of that change is one of the most clinically reliable indicators that death is near. The pattern has a name: Cheyne-Stokes respiration, taken from the two physicians who first described it in the early 1800s. In practice, it consists of cycles of breathing that rise and then fall away. Several breaths occur in succession, growing a little deeper and a little faster, then tapering into shallower and shallower breaths, followed by a pause in which breathing stops completely. These pauses, called apneas, can last anywhere from a few seconds to nearly a full minute. Then, the cycle starts again. For the person who is dying, this is not uncomfortable. The oxygen-sensing mechanisms of the brain are going offline, so the desperate urge to breathe that a healthy person would feel while holding the breath is not triggered in the same way. The brainstem, the most ancient part of the brain, and the part that governs automatic breathing and heartbeat, continues to try to maintain its rhythms, yet it is working with less and less material to work with. The Cheyne-Stokes pattern is essentially that brainstem doing its best with a failing system. It is the biological equivalent of a car engine sputtering on an almost empty tank. For the people in the room, it is one of the hardest things to watch. Observing someone stop breathing and then waiting, sometimes for 30 or 40 or 50 seconds, for the next breath to arrive, and then watching them breathe again and restarting the count, is an experience that remains with observers. Hospice nurses and physicians are trained to explain the pattern, to normalize it, and to tell families that it does not represent suffering. Knowing that fact does not make the sight easy to endure. Alongside the changes in breathing, something else frequently occurs that is equally distressing for those who watch. A sound appears. Hospice workers call it the death rattle. The term sounds harsh, yet it describes a process that is medically quite benign. As swallowing reflexes weaken, saliva and mucus collect in the back of the throat. Air passing through those secretions produces a gurgling, rattling sound with each inhale and each exhale. Medical evidence is consistent on one central point. This sound is not a sign of distress or pain in the dying person. It sounds terrible. By all accounts, it is not terrible to experience. Most people at this stage are deeply unconscious and unaware of it. The people sitting with them, however, hear it. That sound, more than almost anything else at the end of life, is what remains in the memory of those who are left behind. Attention now turns to the brain, because this is where the events become genuinely extraordinary. For most of the history of medicine, death was understood as a relatively simple off switch. The heart stops, blood flow ceases, the brain runs out of oxygen, and everything goes dark. It was regarded as a sad but mechanically unremarkable conclusion, a shutdown rather than an event. Research from roughly the last decade has begun to suggest that this picture is wrong, or at least radically incomplete. In 2013, a team of researchers monitoring the brains of dying rats discovered something that no one expected. In the seconds immediately after cardiac arrest, the rats' brains did not fall silent. They erupted with activity. High-frequency brain waves, known as gamma oscillations, the same pattern associated with heightened consciousness, focused attention, vivid dreaming, and memory retrieval, rose to levels actually higher than those recorded during normal wakefulness. The dying brain was not powering down. It was briefly and paradoxically going into overdrive. Then, in 2023, researchers published findings from EEG monitoring of 4 human patients who died after life support was withdrawn. 2 of those 4 patients displayed the same pattern. As oxygen levels fell and the heart stopped, a rapid surge of gamma wave activity appeared in brain regions linked to conscious processing, visual areas, spatial awareness centers, and regions involved in integrating sensory information and forming memories. These were not random noise. They were organized, coherent oscillations of the kind the brain produces during its most active and aware states. What that means remains uncertain. The hypothesis that researchers keep returning to, carefully because this is science and not wishful thinking, is that the surge in brain activity may be the neurological correlate of what near-death experience survivors describe. That description includes a feeling of profound vividness, a sudden life review, and the sense of memories flooding back with extraordinary clarity and emotional intensity. The dying brain, starved of oxygen and with nothing left to lose, may briefly generate one of the most intense, conscious experiences of a lifetime. It does so not as a comfort and not as a design feature, but possibly simply as a consequence of the chemistry that unfolds when the machinery comes apart. That observation leads directly to the chemistry, because the brain at the end of life is also doing something remarkable at the molecular level. As the body undergoes the extreme physiological stress of dying, it releases a cascade of neurochemicals. Endorphins, the brain's natural opioids, are produced in large quantities. These are the same chemicals that produce a runner's high, that blunt pain during injury, and that create feelings of warmth and euphoria during intense physical experiences. In the context of dying, they are thought to buffer pain and to contribute to the calm, even peaceful expressions that hospice workers consistently report seeing on the faces of people in their final hours, even when those deaths follow serious illness or injury. Serotonin is released in elevated amounts. Serotonin regulates mood, perception, and consciousness, and elevated serotonin is the mechanism by which hallucinogenic compounds such as psilocybin produce their effects, including vivid visual experiences, altered time perception, and feelings of universal connection. In the dying brain, rising serotonin may contribute to the hallucinatory quality of the experience. Then there is DMT, dimethyltryptamine, a naturally occurring psychedelic compound produced in small amounts by the human brain, particularly by the pineal gland. It is widely hypothesized, though not yet definitively proven, that the dying brain releases DMT in significantly larger quantities than normal. The evidence for this claim is partly indirect. Researchers who compare near-death experience accounts with DMT trip reports find the similarity striking enough to be scientifically relevant. Both involve sensations of leaving the body, tunnels of light, encounters with perceived entities, timelessness, and an overwhelming sense of meaning. A 2018 study administered DMT to participants in a controlled clinical setting and found that their reported experiences were uncannily similar to near-death accounts in content, emotional intensity, and structure. Massive releases of adrenaline and noradrenaline are also occurring. The fight or flight chemicals flood the body in one last survival attempt. These may contribute to the heightened state of awareness that some near-death survivors describe. A system going into maximum effort, emergency mode, and marshalling every resource it still has access to. The net effect of all this chemistry in the final minutes may be an experience of consciousness that is, by the measures used for any other experience, genuinely intense. It is not necessarily painful. It is not necessarily frightening. It may be the opposite. It may be something closer to transcendence than to loss, although science is not in a position to make confident claims about that point. It is important to remain honest about what is known and what remains speculation. One of the most striking and practically important findings that research has established about the final hour concerns the senses, specifically which ones fade first and which one endures the longest. Vision dims early. The eyes, even if open, lose their ability to focus and process. Taste and smell, already diminished in the final days, fade further. Touch persists longer than most people expect. The sensation of a hand being held or a gentle touch on the forehead is likely still being registered well into unconsciousness. Hospice workers and palliative care nurses often tell families to keep touching and to keep holding hands because there is genuine reason to believe that physical contact is still reaching something even when the person appears completely unresponsive. Then there is hearing. Hearing is the last sense to go. This is not merely folk wisdom, passed down through generations of hospice workers. A research team at the University of British Columbia tested the claim using EEG to measure brain responses to sound in patients who were in the final hours of life and completely unresponsive. The brains of those patients still showed measurable responses to auditory stimuli. The dying brain was still, at some level, processing sound and still registering that something was being said, even if the person could not signal awareness in any way. This finding matters enormously for families, because it means that the words spoken in that room, even when the person appears completely gone, and even when there has been no response for hours, may still be reaching them. The voice of someone they love, filtered through whatever remains of their auditory processing, may still be landing somewhere. The researchers who conducted the study were careful not to overclaim. They could not confirm whether the dying patients were consciously aware of what they were hearing, yet they demonstrated with measurable brain activity that the auditory system was still functioning and still receiving. Hospice philosophy has operated on this assumption for decades. Keep talking. Keep saying what needs to be said. Keep playing the music they loved. Keep being present with your voice, even after everything else seems to have faded. For once, the science agrees. It is useful to address the near-death experience directly because it is the part of this topic that generates the most questions, the most hope, and the most controversy. Near-death experiences, often abbreviated NDEs, have been reported for thousands of years across virtually every culture in forms that are remarkably consistent with one another, despite the fact that the people having them had no contact with each other and no shared cultural template. For what dying should feel like. Common elements include a tunnel of light, a life review, a feeling of overwhelming peace, a sense of leaving the body and observing it from above, an encounter with a presence or a figure, and being told it is not yet time before being sent back. These are not rare experiences. Studies of cardiac arrest survivors consistently find that somewhere between 6 and 12% report some form of NDE. That is not a trivial number of people, and the consistency of the descriptions across cultures, ages, religious backgrounds, and historical periods is one of the features that leads researchers to take the phenomenon seriously, regardless of what they believe it means. And what causes it remains an open question. The honest answer is that we do not fully know. The gamma wave surge accounts for some of the neurological substrate. The chemistry involving endorphins, serotonin, and possible DMT release accounts for some of the phenomenology. Oxygen deprivation alone can produce tunnel vision and altered states. The REM intrusion hypothesis suggests that the brainstem, in an emergency, may trigger something resembling a dream state in a brain that is otherwise becoming unconscious. All of these mechanisms are real and documented. None of them has been definitively shown to be the complete explanation. What can be said is that the subjective experience reported by people who have come very close to death and returned is almost uniformly described as positive rather than terrifying or painful. It is often described as the most beautiful experience of their lives. People who have had NDEs consistently report reduced fear of death afterward, a reorientation toward what they describe as genuinely important in life, and a sense that what they encountered was more real, not less real, than ordinary waking experience. Science cannot tell anyone what that means. Philosophy cannot fully tell anyone what that means. Yet the data on what people experience and how it changes them is consistent enough to take seriously. In the very final minutes, after the breathing has become agonal, barely present, and more like occasional sighs than any recognizable respiratory rhythm, the heart delivers its last effective contractions. Blood pressure falls to nothing. The brain, deprived of the oxygen it needs to maintain even the most minimal function, begins to go finally and completely silent. Even this process is not instantaneous. Clinical death, defined as the cessation of heartbeat and breathing, is not the same as biological death, the end of all cellular activity. For minutes after the heart stops, some neurons are still firing. Some cells are still processing whatever remains in the system. The boundary is not a sharp line but a gradient, and exactly where it falls is something that modern medicine is still actively debating, with real consequences for questions about organ donation, resuscitation, timing, and the definition of death itself. By most measurements, the brain's electrical activity is gone within minutes of the heart stopping. Those final minutes, however, containing the gamma wave surge, the neurochemical cascade, and whatever subjective experience they may produce, remain genuinely mysterious. They sit right at the edge of what science can observe and what it can explain, and they remain one of the most genuinely open questions in all of neuroscience. What the final hour of life is not, and this point is worth stating clearly, is what most people fear. It is almost never characterized by severe pain in cases where good palliative care is available. It is almost never characterized by fear or agitation during the final period of unconsciousness. The bodily changes, the cooling extremities, the altered breathing, and the death rattle are distressing to witness, yet they are not, as far as medicine can determine, distressing to experience. The brain's own chemistry appears to blunt the sharp edges of the process. What most dying people look like in those final minutes is peaceful, not in a euphemistic, nothing to worry about sense, but in an observable, physiological sense of what the face actually looks like. The muscles relax fully in ways they never quite managed during ordinary sleep. The features soften. The body, which has been working so hard for so long, finally stops working, and what remains is stillness. Whether something else continues, whether consciousness persists in any form beyond the last electrical signal in the brain, is a question that science cannot currently answer and may never be able to answer. It is the oldest question, and it remains open. What science can tell us is that the journey to that threshold is far richer, far stranger, and far less bleak than most people imagine. A brain fires in extraordinary patterns. A chemistry produces states of experience that survivors describe as profound. A sensory system holds on to sound and holds on to the voices of the people who matter longer than almost anything else. A body, right up until the very end, does everything it knows how to do to keep the person inside it present. Then, quietly, it stops. Whatever was there, the accumulated weight of a whole life, every memory, every relationship, every moment of joy and grief, and ordinary Wednesday afternoon, either goes somewhere else or it does not. Science is still working on that